You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 329, Signing the Peace Treaty. Back in episode 320, we covered the preliminary peace agreement that the delegations from Britain and the U.S. reached in the fall of 1782. That preliminary agreement resulted in a cessation of hostilities and a great amount of celebration. But the war could not actually be over until that preliminary agreement became a final treaty. One of the big impediments to the final treaty was the fact that the U.S. could not sign off on a final peace until Britain and France also did so. And France could not sign off on a peace until Spain also agreed to a peace with Britain. Spain had entered the war back in 1779 with the primary goal of taking back Gibraltar. Spain had ceded Gibraltar to Britain in 1713 as part of an agreement to get Britain to end its role in the War of Spanish Succession. Ever since then, Spain had been trying to get back this small rocky outcropping at the southern tip of Spain. Spain and France had been besieging Gibraltar since 1779. While the attacks had greatly damaged the area, the highly defensible position and several successful resupply missions prevented the British garrison from being dislodged. The final push by France and Spain to recapture the rock failed in October 1782. The following month, at the same time Britain was negotiating terms with the Americans, it was also in negotiations with France. Gerard de Ravenel came to London to negotiate directly with Prime Minister Shelburne. France was treaty obligated to help Spain regain control of Gibraltar, so this was critical to any final peace. In these discussions, Shelburne suggested that Britain might consider giving up Gibraltar if France and Spain could compensate it with other properties somewhere else around the world. These might include Minorca in the Mediterranean, which France had recently taken from Britain. Shelburne also wanted West Florida, which would give Britain access to the Mississippi River. Britain was also considering several valuable sugar islands in the West Indies. The two sides did actually work out a complicated series of land swaps that touched on the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and which would result in the return of Gibraltar to Spain. The French negotiator, Gerard de Ravenel, returned to Paris in late November with a preliminary deal in hand. French Foreign Minister Vergennes summoned Spanish Ambassador Conde de Aranda to discuss the deal, and the men agreed to the terms. When Gerard de Ravenel returned to Britain with the good news, he learned that Shelburne could not finalize the deal. Shelburne's own cabinet revolted at the idea of turning over Gibraltar to Spain. The recent heroic defense of Gibraltar had captured the popular mood in London. The only way this was going to work was if Spain and France offered more valuable sugar islands to compensate Britain. The talks appeared on the verge of collapse, but then Spain blinked. The Conde de Aranda told Vergennes that he had been authorized to negotiate on letting Britain keep Gibraltar if Spain could get a valuable price of other real estate. If Spain could get both East and West Florida, as well as Minorca, it might be willing to forgo its demand of Gibraltar. The debate went back and forth into December. By this time, the terms of the peace deal with the Americans were known to all. Prime Minister Shelburne was facing a possible vote of no confidence in Parliament, which could throw all of this work back to square one. There was also another deadline. Recall a few episodes back, I mentioned that Spain and France were putting together an armada at Cadiz, led by the Admiral d'Estaing and General Lafayette. This armada planned to sail to recapture Jamaica, expel the British from New York, and then recapture Canada. The ships were ready to leave port, and once they left, they could not be recalled. Those attacks would pretty much guarantee that the war would continue for at least another year, and that the final treaty terms would be greatly impacted by the success or failure of that mission. As a result, even if Spain was ultimately agreeable to the deal currently on the table, the lack of a quick answer might be as good as a no. Fortunately, the Spanish ambassador Aranda approved the deal without demanding to even consult with leaders back in Madrid. The powers quibbled over a few other details, but by January 20th, 1783, Britain, France, and Spain all agreed to terms for a final peace. Although the agreement was provisional and had to receive final approval from all governments, that seemed likely. In Cadiz, the Armada had been scheduled to depart on January 16th, but after d'Estaing received word that a peace treaty was imminent, he delayed his departure. After receiving word of the treaty on February 2nd, d'Estaing shut down the mission. The Netherlands had largely been left out of these negotiations. With all of its allies agreeing to peace terms, the Dutch had to give the British acceptable terms. The Netherlands agreed to a general ceasefire that became effective in January of 1783. They would eventually sign a treaty with Britain, but that was more than a year away. The U.S. received just about everything the commissioners wanted. Britain acknowledged the U.S. as free, sovereign, and independent states. It recognized the U.S. boundary reaching west to the Mississippi and agreeable boundaries with Canada and Florida. There was even a secret provision that I didn't mention earlier that set the border between Florida and Georgia differently depending on whether Britain or Spain ultimately took control of that area. The British Army would leave U.S. territory and turn over all land within U.S. borders. Any British property in the U.S. would be forfeited to the U.S. The treaty also granted Americans fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. Britain received a clause that British creditors would be allowed to pursue lawful debts. The U.S. would not confiscate property in the future from loyalists, but would only recommend to the states to provide restitution for property already taken from loyalists. The treaty between France and Great Britain permitted France to keep several islands in the West Indies, including St. Lucia and Tobago. France gave up Grenada, the Grenadines, St. Vincent, Dominica, St. Kitts, Nevis, and Montserrat. Britain ceded Minorca and East and West Florida to Spain, but took the islands of Providencia and the Bahamas, as well as retaining Gibraltar. With the diplomats having completed their work, they next had to wait for various governments to confirm the agreements that they had reached. For the American diplomats especially, this meant they had to remain in Europe to finalize the treaty and wait for the long transatlantic trips to take place, delivering and returning with information. Even so, the peace agreement seemed so established that Benjamin Franklin considered making a trip to England in the spring of 1783. 6 months earlier, such a visit probably would have resulted in his imprisonment in the Tower of London. He ended up not making the trip, but it had nothing to do with any fear from British authorities. Another of the delegates, Henry Lawrence, who actually did serve time as a prisoner in the Tower of London, returned to Britain after the peace agreement to rest and recuperate in Bath. Franklin, however, occupied himself by returning to printing in France. He printed a bound copy of all the state constitutions in French to be distributed to diplomats and other government officials throughout Europe. He also began working on a treaty of amity and commerce between the U.S. and Sweden, and started similar initiatives with Denmark and Portugal. Now, Franklin had been willing to abandon his obligations under the treaty with France and agreed with the other American delegates to sign that preliminary peace treaty with France. Now, despite Franklin's willingness to be flexible, John Adams still believed Franklin was too captivated by French interests. Adams did not let up on his criticisms of Franklin as the delegates waited in France. Just as the delegation was finalizing its negotiations on the preliminary peace treaty, another rift began to divide Adams and Franklin. Adams wanted to appoint a man named Edmund Jennings as secretary to the diplomatic mission in France. Adams introduced Jennings to Henry Lawrence, who at first seemed to like the guy but then quickly cooled to the idea. And Jennings was an American who had been living in Europe during the war and had published a number of pamphlets. Several of these early on were in favor of independence, but others seemed to divide the American peace commissioners. Meanwhile, Franklin had someone else in mind to be secretary. He wanted his grandson, William Temple Franklin. Now 21 years old, Temple had been serving as his grandfather's personal secretary for 7 years. He spoke French and had developed his own relationships in the French court at Versailles. Franklin wrote to Congress's Secretary for Foreign Affairs recommending that Temple be given the position and suggesting that if Temple didn't get the job, that Benjamin Franklin would consider leaving his post and taking his grandson on a grand tour of Europe. Having completed the preliminary treaty, Franklin just decided on his own to make Temple Secretary of the Peace Commission near the end of 1782. Franklin got John Jay to agree to the appointment, but did not even bother to ask or even notify John Adams. When he did find out, Adams was livid. It wasn't just that Franklin was handing out a lucrative position to a family member. After all, John Quincy Adams at the time was serving as an aide to the American delegation in Russia, thanks to his father's efforts. And Edmund Jennings, the man Adams did want for the secretary, was a cousin of his wife Abigail. Adams disliked Temple for many of the same reasons that he disliked Temple's grandfather. The puritanical New Englander was disgusted by the lavish lifestyle, punctuated by drinking and womanizing, in which the Franklins engaged. Adams's mindset was probably not helped by the fact that he was trying to fight a battle via correspondence to Massachusetts, trying to convince his daughter Nabby not to marry an aggressive suitor. Adams was also open to the criticisms levied by men like Arthur Lee and William Lee. These men had opposed Franklin for years and levied all sorts of accusations. They also turned their wrath on Temple. Arthur Lee called Temple a young, insignificant boy, implying that only his grandfather's status gave him any chance at a government position. William Lee referred to Temple as a bastard twice over, a reference to the fact that he was an illegitimate son of his father William, and that William was the illegitimate son of his father Benjamin. Adams himself wrote in a letter regarding Franklin, quote, "His whole life has been one continued insult to good manners and to decency." The fact that Temple's father was an infamous Tory, by this time living in London, and the fact that Temple had only lived in America for 18 months of his life led to concerns about whether he really had America's true interests at heart. Adams had already expressed concerns that Benjamin Franklin seemed too pro-French. In several letters to America, Adams expressed the belief that France had actually delayed a peace with Britain by several years, and that Franklin was a pawn that Vergennes was using to promote French interests. Since Temple spoke fluent French and had served in Versailles, Adams believed that Temple had become much more French than American. Adams came to believe that Franklin was setting up Temple to replace his grandfather at the Peace Commission in France so that Franklin could take a position as ambassador to Britain in the court of St. James. In truth, Franklin had zero interest in serving in London. Adams did want the position and worried that Franklin was a rival. Now, when Temple met with Adams in January 1783 to request that Adams sign a document approving his appointment as secretary retroactive to the previous October, Adams exploded. Temple already had the commission signed by 3 other commissioners. Franklin had written the document. Jay had apparently signed the document sometime in October when the commission was finalizing the preliminary treaty and Franklin was sick in bed. At that time, Temple was acting as an active courier for Franklin and was very involved in all the negotiations. Henry Lawrence did not arrive in France until late November and returned to Britain in January. He signed the commission just before crossing the Channel in hopes of spending some time relaxing at Bath. After receiving Lawrence's signature, Temple went to see Adams. Now, because Adams had been originally appointed as the sole peace commissioner to Britain, he considered himself the head of the delegation and thought it an effrontery that Franklin had gotten all the other commissioners to agree to the appointment without even discussing the matter with Adams. Temple used his best and some humility and respect to get Adams to come around, but nothing seemed to work. Since Temple had the approval of 3 of the 4 commissioners, he did continue to serve as secretary. Adams eventually came around and signed the document, but that would be 9 months later, in September of 1783. The peace commissioners had little to do but bicker with each other for months after sending the preliminary treaty to Congress in November of 1782. In early 1783, Congress was still debating whether to give the commissioners more latitude in negotiating a treaty without France, and that's when the preliminary treaty arrived. The pro-French delegates in Congress were outraged by the fact that the commissioners had negotiated a separate peace with Britain, cutting France out of the negotiations. They saw this as a betrayal of the French alliance and something that would hurt the U.S. in international relations. There was particularly intense debate about the secret clause that set the border between the U.S. and Florida, depending on whether Britain or Spain ultimately took control of Florida. Of course, the congressional delegates who were in favor of giving the delegates in France more latitude were very pleased about the favorable terms that the treaty gave to the U.S. based on those in France taking the initiative. The members of Congress continued to argue about this before receiving word in March 1783 that France and Britain had also come to terms on a preliminary treaty. At that point, the matter seemed settled. Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Livingston, finally wrote a response to the delegates in late March, congratulating them on the provisions in the preliminary treaty, but also criticizing them for negotiating without France's involvement. In April, he confirmed to the commissioners that Congress had ratified the preliminary treaty, and by May, Livingston was complaining that he had not heard any further progress on the final treaty in Europe. Now, there was reason for concern. At the end of March, the Shelburne ministry in London fell after only 8 months in office. In April of 1783, a coalition under Charles James Fox and Lord North took control of Parliament. The new prime minister was a guy named William Cavendish Bentinck, the Duke of Portland, but everyone knew that Fox and North were the real powers in Parliament. And these two factions could not have been more different. Fox was the really liberal coalition that had supported American independence for years in Parliament. Lord North, of course, continued the war longer than anyone else wanted and held the very conservative positions that King George had espoused. Beyond the issue of American independence, these two factions disagreed on just about any issue you could come up with, and the only reason they were together was because of their shared hatred as Shelburne as prime minister. For the Americans, there was real cause for concern without a final treaty. Britain could just back out of this preliminary treaty and resume the war. And it didn't help that North pushed for a vote condemning the peace treaty that the Shelburne government had already negotiated and approved. The new government sent David Hartley to negotiate the final terms of a treaty. Although Hartley was a liberal in Parliament and had been outspoken for years about ending the war with the colonies, he was also a close ally of Lord North and had actually voted against the Shelburne peace plan in Parliament. The commissioners were relieved when Hartley revealed that Britain was still willing to sign a final treaty, largely based on the terms spelled out in the preliminary treaty. Franklin had actually known Hartley since the 1760s, and the two men got along quite well. Hartley and the commissioners debated a few other issues that they might want to add to the treaty, mostly involving trade. The commissioners agreed that U.S. ports would be open to British trade following the final evacuation of the British Army from New York, and much of their discussions at the time dealt with the details about how the British Army would actually evacuate. After a few weeks, Hartley sent the terms to London for final approval. He and the delegates waited most of the summer with no word from the government. In fairness, the coalition was a mess. The king, who loathed Fox, refused to cooperate with the coalition in any way. As I said, the two factions agreed on very little. It was a matter of debate whether this divided government would even survive much longer. After nearly 2 months of waiting for a decision from London, Hartley decided on his own just to finalize the official treaty. Although the two sides had discussed a few changes, Hartley proposed that they simply sign the final treaty based on the preliminary one without any substantive changes. He could at least justify that without getting any further word from London. The parties agreed to meet on September 3rd for a formal signing. Franklin, Jay, and Temple rode to Paris, where Adams joined them. Lawrence, who was still in Britain, did not participate. The secretaries reviewed 4 copies of the treaty. The only substantive changes were an added provision spelling out the ratification process and the removal of that provision which related to the Florida border, since Spain by this time had set its own border based on its own treaty with Britain. At 10:30, the 3 delegates signed and affixed their seals to the treaty, as did Hartley, acting on behalf of the king. Hartley also assured the commissioners that they would continue to negotiate a treaty on trade once this peace treaty had been resolved. Traditionally, the two countries exchanged gifts following a treaty. The king had suggested a cash gift. Hartley discussed the matter, offering a £500 cash gift to each of the 4 delegates. But since the delegates had nothing to give in return and were also concerned about insulting the king by refusing his gift, there ended up being considerable discussion about the matter, but in the end no gifts were exchanged and the matter was just dropped. The commissioners then sent a copy of the treaty to Versailles, where Vergennes and the Spanish ambassador signed their own peace treaty with Britain that same day, thus bringing the war to an end. Always the odd man out, the Dutch had only reached a preliminary treaty with Britain the day before the final treaty that France, Spain, and the U.S. signed. The final treaty with the Dutch would not be finalized for several more months. That afternoon, however, Vergennes hosted a dinner for everyone involved in all the treaties. There were 31 people who attended the dinner. Following the event, Franklin commented to Jay that this treaty would probably be the most notable achievement for which all of them would be remembered. He then referenced the Bible, quote, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Jay also responded that he would be proud of his role in this negotiation. Adams, ever the pessimist, worried that the treaty could have been better and hoped they would not see another war in their lifetime. As far as all the government leaders were concerned, though, the war was over, and it was time to start living in the new peace. Next week, we see the real tangible results of that peace as the British Army in New York evacuates the United States. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Greg Pusak, and 10 Crucial Days. Their generosity and the generosity of everyone who contributes to this podcast allows me to continue this project. I greatly appreciate everyone who supports this podcast at any level, either through a subscription on Patreon or through one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. Now, this week, we covered the process that finalized the peace treaty ending the war. The British dragged their feet in the preliminary treaty negotiations until it realized that its government might collapse and mess up the whole process. Then, after it did collapse, the government dragged its feet again for another 10 months, until the fear of the new government collapsing seemed to light a fire under the British negotiators and David Hartley. The concern about the stability of the Fox North government was really justified. The coalition ended up collapsing in December after a vote to nationalize the East India Company failed. Part of the reason that East India vote failed was that the king announced to the House of Lords that he would regard anyone who voted for the bill as his enemy. The king used the opportunity of that failed vote to dump the Duke of Portland as prime minister, leading to a new government formed by William Pitt the Younger, and William Pitt would remain as prime minister for the next 8 years. By the time the North Fox coalition government fell in December, Parliament still had not ratified the treaty. Even so, the new Parliament under Pitt would finally ratify it, as would the Continental Congress. Henry Lawrence and John Jay both spent time in Britain following the treaty, but not in any official capacity. Both of them would end up back in America by the end of 1784. One issue that I really didn't get into in the main episode as much as I would have liked was the situation with Edmund Jennings, who was the guy Adams wanted to become the commissioner's secretary. I did mention that Adams liked Jennings and that he was a cousin of his wife Abigail and that Lauren had quashed the idea. What I really didn't have time to get into was there was a major rift that developed between Jennings and Lawrence as a result of Jennings not getting the position. Jennings ended up printing several pamphlets in 1783 and 1784 directly attacking Lawrence, and that Jennings and Lawrence even came very close to engaging in a duel in London in the summer of 1784. Franklin and Adams remained in France with almost nothing to do through most of 1783 and 1784. They were trying to set up commercial treaties with various European countries, but Congress was not providing much information or giving them any guidance. As a result, very little got done. Franklin was joined in France in the summer of 1783 by his other grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, whom Franklin had sent to Switzerland for his education when he first arrived in France in 1776, when young Benny was only 7 years old. Now returning at age 15, Benny was having trouble speaking English. Franklin decided that he needed to spend more time with the boy. Another fun thing that happened around this time that I didn't have time to get into in the main show was the excitement over balloons. The Montgolfier brothers had managed to launch hot air balloons in late 1783. Some of the first balloons carried animals into the air and then people, thus launching the age of flight. Franklin and the other delegates, as well as Franklin's grandchildren, all enjoyed going to see the balloons. Beyond such distractions, Franklin and Adams finally seemed to reach a detente with each other, but factions in Congress did not want either of the men to come home. The pro-French faction in America feared letting Franklin come home and leaving Adams alone in France, since Adams had such a horrible relationship with the French government. The anti-French faction feared letting Adams come home and leaving Franklin alone in France, because everybody in that faction thought Franklin was too well captured by French interests. Thus, the U.S. government wanted to keep the two men in France to keep each other in check. In the summer of 1784, Congress finally sent Thomas Jefferson to join the delegation. Abigail Adams also traveled to France around this same time, which probably put John Adams in a much better mood. Even with that, little got done. The Americans were still trying to push trade deals with other countries in Europe. The Americans wanted to really push the idea of free trade, while European powers still wanted their imperial systems. Temple, who wanted to replace his grandfather as the American minister to France, was not only denied that. Thomas Jefferson would end up replacing Franklin as minister in 1785, although Jefferson quipped that no one could replace Franklin, they could only succeed him. Temple also found out that Congress was going to replace him as secretary. So Temple ended up going to London in late 1784 to spend some time with his father. It was during this time that Benjamin Franklin actually became the first recipient of a letter via airmail. A friend of William Franklin managed to cross the channel in a hot air balloon, bringing a letter from Temple to his grandfather. In April of 1785, Adams finally received word that he would become the ambassador to the court of St. James in London. Franklin could finally return home to Philadelphia. That summer, Franklin packed up his household and returned to America. On his way home, he briefly stopped in England, where he met with his son William. Their meeting has been described as chilly, with the main point being some business to attend to. William had to transfer ownership of some properties in America to Temple. Now, before I make my book recommendation this week, I want to note that I relied heavily on several Franklin biographies for this week's episode, particularly the one by Stacy Schiff, which I've recommended in an earlier episode. From what I read, the Adams biographies seem to skip over the period between the preliminary treaty and the final treaty. I also looked at a few biographies for Lawrence and Jay, but found little there as well. So much of this episode may be written with a bit of a pro-Franklin bias. But it seems the reason that the other biographies skip over this period, especially for Adams, is that Adams really doesn't come off particularly well. He seems petulant and on the wrong side of history, attacking Franklin and showing a pretty blatant hatred of France more generally. My book recommendation this week, though, is The Treaty of Paris, The Precursor to a New Nation, by Edward Renahan. This is actually a pretty short book at just over 100 pages and can be a little simplistic at times. I actually think the book was written for high school students, but it does do a reasonable job of covering the events I talked about this week. Renahan is a full-time author, and this book was published in 2007. So if this sounds interesting to you, the book title is The Treaty of Paris, The Precursor to a New Nation. My online recommendation is Definitive Treaty of Peace between the U.S. and Great Britain, 3 September 1783. This is available on Founders Online. This is not only a full text of the treaty, but it also contains a description of the signing and the events that surrounded it. So I found that pretty interesting. As always, I've included a direct link on my blog and website. My question this week asks, what does taxation without representation mean, And why wasn't this motto necessarily true during the American Revolution? Well, I think I've discussed this before, but taxation without representation means that it is considered illegitimate for a body to impose a tax on you if you are not represented in that body. Now, this was in large part the cause of the English Civil War 100 years before the Revolution, when the king attempted to impose taxes without the approval of Parliament. The Parliament was the representative of the people, the king was not. In the case of the American Revolution, Parliament attempted to impose taxes on the colonies, even though the colonies had no representation in Parliament. The colonies paid taxes to colonial legislatures, where they were represented, but they hadn't paid any taxes to Parliament until the attempts to do so in the 1760s. The idea behind this term is that if you don't have representation in the body that's taxing you, the taxes can grow without you having any way to stop them. At some point, the taxes become confiscatory, and you just have this foreign body seizing virtually all of your property. Now, this was more than just theoretical. Just a few years before the revolution began, the British colony at Bengal went through a famine. And because all the wealth had been stripped from that region for many years prior, there was no cushion to help the famine victims. Had these people been represented in Parliament, it almost certainly would have provided aid to relieve the starvation. It did not, and millions literally starved to death. Now, you ask how this motto was not true. As I say, I think it is true. I think it's correct. I suppose the argument against this motto, which was put forward by some in Britain at the time, was that the colonies were virtually represented in Parliament. The argument was that all members of Parliament work for the good of the entire British Empire and therefore represent all the people. Personally, I think this argument is nonsense, but it was one that was put forth at the time. To talk about the importance of taxation without representation, I like to use a modern example. In most places today, a sales tax in most states in the U.S. is around 6 or 8%. However, in those same jurisdictions, the hotel tax or the parking tax on sales is often 15 or 20%. The difference is, of course, that people staying in hotels or using paid parking lots usually do not live and cannot vote for those imposing those taxes. Therefore, the tax rate on the transaction is more than double what it is for other things. Politicians usually try harder to keep taxes low if they know they will be answerable to the voters being taxed. That is the importance of taxation without representation. The founders understood this, and we should too. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.